Hello, friends, and welcome to the Little Woman podcast. I am your host, Nina, and here we discuss all things related to Little Woman and Louisa May Alcott. One of my current projects is to read books that Louisa May Alcott liked to read. I must say, there is a pretty easy starting point for this because we actually have an actual book list that Louisa wrote about the books that she liked to read. One of the books mentioned in Little Woman is called White White World. You may have heard me discussing this book a few times on this channel. There's a moment in Little Woman Part 1 where 15-year-old Jo, quote, was reading and crying over the white white world in the apple tree. White White World has a romance very similar to Jo and Friedrich in Little Woman, and I just like the idea of 15-year-old Jo reading this book and then living a similar romance later on. If you guys wish to read White White World, you can find it for free from Project Gutenberg. I will spoil the entire book for you and compare Little Woman and the White White World. So, a spoiler alert. Let's look at the White White World's history and its author. This is a Little Woman podcast, Origins of Little Woman, the White White World. White White World is a book written by American author Susan Warner. It has been a couple of years since I read it myself. I did find it quite fascinating. The book is very religious, and when it was published, it was considered one of the very first feminist books at the time. And The White White World, it was published around 1850. The first wave of feminism tackled things like women's right to vote and allowing women to study in universities. During this time period, beginning of the 19th century, there was a shift in marriages. There have always been marriages that were based on a couple loving each other, but many of the marriages at the time were also based on money. However, during the Victorian era, there was more emphasis on love-based marriages. And this is also a theme in White White World, as well as in Little Woman. Susan Bogart Warner was born in New York City on July 11th, 1819. Susan's father, Henry Warner, was a lawyer, and her mother, Anna, came from an upper-class family. Susan also had a sister called Anna. When Susan was a young girl, her mother sadly passed away, and her father's sister, Fanny, moved to live with the family and keep the house for them. Their father lost all of their money in the financial crisis of 1837. The family became penniless and had to move from a mansion to a much more humble home in 1949 in West Point, New York. That is when Susan and her sister Anna started writing to support their family financially, similar to how Louisa May Alcott began her writing career. Susan was a Presbyterian. Sometimes in the 1830s, she experienced a spiritual awakening. Susan's books became very popular. Her most famous work, White White World, was a bestseller when it first appeared. Her characters face hardships in their lives. Their faith is being tested, and there are many theological discussions between them. She can make the reader reflect on their own spiritual worldview. I think that is one of the reasons why her books were so popular at this time. Her books also appeared during the First World War, and in my experience, especially in the past when there was a war going on or otherwise turbulent times, many people would seek help and guidance from religion. She is considered an early feminist because she writes a lot about gender dynamics, which wasn't very common at the time. In general, female writers, as you can guess, were not very common, but the way she writes about gender dynamics is quite fascinating. I found White World a little too sentimental for my taste, but the relationships between the characters were quite interesting. Susan's personal life was very much intertwined with her fate. As one can expect, her books contain many questions of morality and spiritual introspection. Her sister Anna was also a writer. The sisters taught Sunday school together. They were Sunday school teachers at the West Point Military Academy Chapel, so they basically taught the Bible to the soldiers. During the summers, Bible studies took place at their own home on the Constitution Island. The Warner sisters also wrote children's Christian songs. Susan wrote Jesus Bids Us Sunshine, while Anna wrote the first verse of the well-known children's song Jesus Loves Me, which she wrote at Susan's request. I can't say I am familiar with these songs, but maybe some of my American listeners know them. For over 40 years, the sisters were Bible teachers for the soldiers, and they became appreciated by the military community of the area. Susan and her sister Anna are the only female civilians buried in the renowned West Point Cemetery. Susan passed away 17th of March, 1885 at the age of 66. I didn't find anything else related to her personal life, but of course, she might have had romances or at least deep important friendships in her life. Even if a person never married, one never knows what kind of life they truly lived and what they dreamed of. That is one thing I have definitely learned doing making this podcast. But let's move on to the White World. This plot is a straight quote from Wikipedia. The White World is a work of sentimentalism about the life of young Ellen Montgomery. The story begins with Ellen's happy life being disrupted by the fact that her mother is very ill and her father must take her to Europe, requiring Ellen to leave home to live with an almost unknown aunt. Though Ellen tries to act strong for her mother's sake, she is devastated and can find solace in nothing. Eventually, the day comes when Ellen must say goodbye to her mother and travel in the company of strangers to her aunt's home. Unfortunately, these strangers are unkind to Ellen, and she tries to leave the boat on which they are traveling. An old man sees Ellen crying and tells her to trust in God. He teaches her about being Christian, as her mother had done, and asks if she is ready to give her heart to Jesus. After talking with the man, Ellen becomes determined to become a true Christian, which gives her strength for the rest of the journey to her aunt's place in Tarbell. On Ellen's first night in Tarbell, she learns that her father forgot to inform her aunt that she was coming, so a Mr. Van Brunt escorts her to her aunt's home. This aunt, Fortune Emerson, proves to be quite different from Ellen's loving mother. She treats Ellen unkindly and refuses to let her attend school. Ellen hates living with Fortune and comes to find comfort in the society of Mr. Van Brunt and other neighbors as she becomes more familiar with her new surroundings. One day, discovering that her aunt withheld a letter from Mrs. Montgomery, Ellen runs crying into the woods. There she meets Alice Humphreys, the daughter of a local minister. Alice is kind to Ellen and invites her to tea the next day to give Ellen a chance to tell her troubles. Maybe Alice would be able to help. The girls become fast friends and Alice adopts Ellen as a sister, offering to educate her and guide her spiritually, teaching her to forgive others and trust in the Lord. Alice and her brother John, who is away at school much of the time, treat Ellen like family, even inviting her to spend Christmas in the nearby town of Ventnor with them and their friends, the Marshmans. While there, Ellen meets another Ellen, Ellen Chauncey. She also gets better acquainted with John Humphreys, who comforts her many times after the other children tease her. Ellen comes to realize that if she hadn't needed to be separated from her mother, she might never have met Alice and John. About a year later, one day when Ellen visits town, she overhears from some ladies conversation that her mother has died. Devastated, she turns to Alice and her Bible for comfort. She stays with Alice and John until Aunt Fortune becomes ill and Ellen must look after her. Eventually, Aunt Fortune recovers and Ellen returns to Alice and her other friends. After Mr. Van Brunt's mother dies, he decides to marry Aunt Fortune. Soon after, Alice tells Ellen that she is very ill and will soon be going home to heaven. Ellen is not to grieve for her, but to trust in God. She also invites Ellen to take her place in the Humphreys household. Ellen immediately moves in and begins by nursing Alice through her final weeks. After Alice dies, Ellen turns to John for guidance. He takes over as her tutor, spiritual advisor, and guiding light. By the time Humphrey's relative dies in England and John must travel overseas to handle the family business, Ellen, though sad to see him go, is a stronger person. One day Nancy visits Ellen, bringing letters that she has found while cleaning Fortune's house. They are for Ellen from her mother and express the wish that Ellen go live with relatives in Scotland. After sharing the letters with Mr. Humphreys, Ellen decides that she must honor her mother's wishes, so the Humphreys send her to Scotland to live with the Lindsays, her grandmother and Uncle Lindsay and Lady Keith. They welcome her into their home and find her delightful, but they become very possessive of her and force her to denounce identity as an American and as a Montgomery. Mr. Lindsay even makes Ellen call him father and refers to her as his own little daughter. The Lindsays also discourage Ellen's faith, as they don't see religion as being important to someone Ellen's age. Ellen finds it hard to live without her daily hours set aside for studying religion, but still tries hard to live by her faith and everything that John and Alice taught her. Ellen misses John more than anything, and during a New Year's Eve party at the Lindsays, he shows up asking for her. The Lindsays try to keep them apart, but they are unsuccessful. During their emotional reunion, John reminds Ellen to keep her faith. In a few years, when she will be able to choose where she lives, she can return to America and live with him. When Ellen introduces John to the Lindsays, they actually become fond of him. John must soon return to America, but not without promising Ellen that they will be together forever soon. In an unpublished chapter at the end of the book, Ellen returns to America as Mrs. John Humphreys. That is the plot of The White White World. This book is considered to be the first American bestseller. White White World is part of sentimental literature, and A Little Woman is part of this style as well. Sentimental literature refers to books that create an emotional response within the reader, and this style was prevalent in 18th and 19th century literature. Sentimental books feature scenes of distress and tenderness, and the plot is arranged to advance emotions and actions. The book creates an emotional response when Jo is reading and crying over the white, white world in the apple tree. A little side note, I think the only version where we see Jo crying over a book is the June Allison version from 1949. There's a lovely scene where I think she's writing her own story and just sobbing all over it. The first obvious connection between the two books is that Ellen loses her mother, who she dearly loves, and she has to move to live with her aunt, who is very abusive towards her. In Little Woman, we have Aunt March, who has a sharp tongue, but is more mellow than Aunt in the White, White World. There is loss of a sister, for Alice is as much of a sister to Ellen as Beth is to Joe. There is an age gap romance. I can't remember the exact age difference between John and Ellen, but it was close to Joe and Fredrik, and theirs was 16 years. There is also a similar plotline in White World and another Louisa May Alcott novel, Work, Story of Experience. In White World, Ellen finds a home with Alice Humphrey and his brother John. In Work, Christie, the protagonist that is based on Louisa, she finds a home and purpose from the home of David, who is based on Henry David Thoreau, and David's sister Letty. I think Ellen as a character is a lot more adaptable than Joe, but they are both brave young women who are hardworking and have very high morals. Ellen is very mild-tempered, which is something that Joe isn't. I found it a little tricky to get to know the characters in White World because the dialogue is always about their fate, which is the basis of their lives. Reading very religious books as this doesn't come that naturally to me. I do like the introspection that the characters go through. I feel bad for Ellen because her relatives are abusing her. People are walking over her. Her faith, which is essential to her, is being mocked, and she goes through a lot. At the beginning of the book, Ellen's agenda is to live a life of a saint, a perfect Christian life without sin, without negativity. She wants to be an example to others, but when she steps into a boat that takes her to her aunt, some people are mean and rude to her. She thinks, how can she be an example of goodness when she feels negativity towards others? She realizes that no one is perfect. We are not meant to be perfect, and we experience both good and bad feelings, which is part of being human. Ever since Louisa May Alcott was a child, she was encouraged to write down her thoughts and feelings and be introspective about her spiritual life and growth. John is not the only spiritual guide for Ellen. Throughout the book, she meets people who encourage her faith. In the woods, she meets a young girl who cheers her up, and she meets an old beggar who helps her. And these kind of people pop up her way as often as she meets people who are mean and horrible towards her. The book has a very strong thesis that God is the one who puts these people on her way. I see similarities between Ellen's relationship with John and Lucy's feelings for Emerson and Henry Thoreau. Ellen loves a sophisticated philosopher who can also be somewhat a spiritual guide for her. John is more stoic character than Friedrich is, but I remember thinking that the dialogue between Ellen and John at the end of the book is very similar to that between Joe and Friedrich. It is pretty lovely. Ellen and John agree to work hard together for their shared future. Joe says the same to Fritz in Under the Umbrella chapter, and I think there was a quote in the White World of the two being on the same boat for the rest of their lives, rowing the boat together, which reminds me the way Laurie proposes Amy to row the boat together with him, which is very sweet. White World is very much a domestic novel. It is a bit of a Cinderella story. As the story progresses, Ellen learns to trust herself and her intuition more. Louisa was only 18 when White World appeared. I imagine that it was an important book to her. It was written by a woman. The book was a bestseller and a coming-of-age novel. That's it for today. You can follow me on Instagram, and my handle there is podcasting Little Woman. Little Woman podcast books are available on Amazon. The link is in the description. Thank you so much for listening. Take care and make good choices. Bye.